This is a continuation of Pilgrim. While up at the lakes, Billington and his friend also came across 6 or 7 Indian hounds. The proximity to savages scared them. They brought only one musket, just one shot, one boom to haul off any assault from the village. But they found the same eerie, inexplicable situation they had always found: habitation without inhabitants. Meanwhile, the settlers were still inhabitants without habitation. While private landowners was their long-term goal, they had to get there by way of temporary communism, a common house where those on shore could stay with reasonable comfort and safety. In a few days put up a basic structure, some 20 feet square. In 4 days, they had half the roof up, but cold and foul weather then hindered them. After they had the roof, they built the walls and packed them with mud. They figured out that the houses would go up a lot faster if every man worked on his own. On January the 9th, a reasonable fair day, they divided their town plans into individual lots. On Thursday, January the 11th, the weather finally hit William Bradford. He was working on shore when all of a sudden he was shot through with pain. The pain had started in his ankles after wading across during the first discoveries. The more recent midwinter dips had made it even worse. Now suddenly he's hurt up to his hip bones. He could hardly go on. He was ready to die. But God stepped in, and by evening, Bradford felt a little better. Bradford, who was a boy, had been too ill and weak to do farm work, was now among the handful of people whose health had not faltered. Miles Standish would be about the only person to make it through the winter without falling ill, and he went far beyond the call of duty as a military man to care for the sick and dying. The elder William Brewster also kept his health. Almost every day, another person died, sometimes several persons. During the worst of the dying, only 6 or 7 people were strong enough to prepare food, to feed the sick, to fetch wood, to make fires, make beds, and change those loathsome clothes. In a word Bradford wrote, they did all the homely and necessary offices of them with dainty and queasy stomachs cannot endure to hear about. They also had to bury the dead. If a few died each day for several days, a backlog of the deceased may well have lain among the living until the weather cleared, or the handful of healthy men had the strength to move them. The chill would have slowed decomposition, but not eliminate the odor that would come with death. When someone died aboard the ship, the healthy had to hoist the cold corpse up out of the gun deck or the gun port and lower it down to the shuffle on a long boat. They rowed the bodies in the shore, maybe passed them on to someone on the famous rock, and then carried them across the beach to somewhere where they could break the frozen ground. The sandy hill just above the beach was the easiest place, so that may have become the cemetery. English tradition would not have called for a hole 6 feet deep, and Calvinist beliefs would not have them mark the grave with a cross. Exhaustion and expediency probably conspired to let an even shallower grave suffice, to keep the Indians from detecting how quickly the English were dying off. They smoothed over the graves, left them level with the ground, and left them unmarked, the flesh of Christians rotting anonymously. To Butentum, the English came to Plymouth expecting to meet bloodthirsty savages, and The Indian tribes had been every reason to suspect the same from the English ships. Both people expected violence. Both could have justified preempt strikes. Yet not a word of Morton's relations or Bradford or Plymouth plantation expressed its disrespect for the people whom the English met in America. Granted, their use of the word savage implied a certain unconscious assumption that these different kind of people, but all judgment reference to these documents are complimentary. They used the words that they were strong, honest, generous, cooperative, valiant, courteous, gentle, fair condition, and personable. In a letter to friends in England, Edward Winslow called them trusty, quick of apprehension, ripe, witty, just. Despite the skirmishes in the first few weeks, the two people had never really hurt each other. They had held their fears and suspicions in reserve and accepted risks in the name of not just political expediency, but in this short time, an extraordinary friendship. In November, the settlers in Poconoket shared a feast. We know about this event from the few sentences in the letter Edwin Winslow writes to friends in England a month later. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, that so we could afterward a more special manner rejoice together after they had gathered the fruit of their labors. They 4 in one day killed as many fowl as with a little help beside served the company almost a week. At which time, among the other recreations, we exercised our arms. Many of the Indians come in amongst us. Amongst the rest, their greatest king, Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted. And they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought in the plantation and bestowed on our governor and upon the captain and others. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time, yet by the goodness of God we are so far from want that we wished you partakers of our plenty. The letter did not mention the dates of the event. It did not use the word Thanksgiving or even thanks, but Winslow's message to the folks back home all but wallowed in the accomplishment of plenitude. After winter under murderous conditions, they had food. They had several houses, not much space for 52 people, but certainly better than the damp, leaky, drafty, unheated ship anchored off the coast. They also had 4 buildings for common use. They had friends. They had their God, and they were at peace with the peoples around them. It's doubtful that the settlers intended to establish an annual holiday. They may have conceived the event for the combination of 3 reasons. For one, they'd been in Plymouth for almost a year. November the 11th would have been that day. But in all likelihood, the feast took place between September 21st, when the shallop returned from the land of the Massachusetts, and November the 9th, Michaelmas, a tradition celebrated held on September the 29th, might have inspired a festival. All right, may have been thought of having a festival as part of the holy day of thanksgiving and praise, a Puritan and separatist celebration that was declared whenever God seemed to be cooperating with human endeavors, or they might have simply decided a good harvest warranted a good meal. The harvest feast was an old English tradition that had little to do with religion beyond standard thanks to God for the harvest and the blessing of each day and each morsel of food. Most likely the event started as a pilgrim celebration, and when Massasoit people came along, they were invited to join in. The presence of almost 100 non-Christians at the feast and Winslow's reference to entertainment would implied that the event was not strictly religious day of thanksgiving and prayer. Such entertainment may have included games, dance, songs, speeches, and revelry. As of any reference to November the 11th or at the end of a successful 12 months in America would hint that the celebration was not oriented around the fact that it held that late in the fall. The traditional harvest feast is the most likely reason the settlers decide to do some extra hunting, break out the stored food, and invite the neighbors over. Only by conjecture can we imagine that the first feast of Thanksgiving, Mrs. Hopkins, Mrs. Billington, Mrs. Brewster, and Mrs. Winslow, the only adult English women north of Jamestown, served up 3-day meals for 150 people, 90 of whom had table manners different from them of the Europeans. But the bare chest, the culture difference, and the language barrier most certainly did not distinguish the obvious that these savages were good people who knew without being told the do unto others love that Jesus had spoken of. Though the Pokanaki had no word for please, they did have one for thanks, to butantam, meant to give thanks, or I thank you. It would be the closest known word to thanksgiving. It derived from a tumpu, sufficient, and antum, the mental sensation of being satisfied. In the small talk of the 3-day feast, the native and the new American may well have taught each other these words. Then they probably used them a lot. For the rest of the story, go to Pilgrim.